The cabin lights glowed softly, a pale amber hum across the rows of passengers who were scattered between slumber, quiet conversations, and the hypnotic rhythm of the engines outside. For most of them, it was nothing more than another long flight across a stretch of endless sky, a bridge of hours between departure and destination. The air smelled faintly of recycled coffee and warm fabric from the seats, with an undertone of jet fuel that always seemed to linger no matter how high the altitude. It was calm, almost comforting. People flipped through magazines without reading them, eyes drifting toward the windows where only streaks of cloud could be seen illuminated by the moon. There was nothing unusual, nothing threatening. The attendants moved slowly down the aisles with practiced grace, checking belts, answering small requests, and pouring water into cups that trembled only with the vibration of the engines. A child leaned against his mother, eyes half closed, lulled to sleep by the distant thrum outside. A businessman scrolled lazily through his phone, disconnecting and reconnecting from the onboard Wi-Fi. Somewhere toward the back, a young woman pulled a blanket closer around her shoulders and shifted into the shallow comfort of an economy-class seat. It was, by every measure, a routine scene. The engines were steady then, a deep bass that filled the background without demanding attention. It was the sound everyone trusted, proof that technology, training, and human expertise were carrying hundreds of lives through the night sky. Calm flight, calm minds. Nobody gave it more thought than they would give the air they were breathing. Safety felt like the default, not a privilege, not something fragile. Outside, stars scattered across the black expanse like shards of glass. They looked still, but the aircraft tore through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour, a paradox of violence wrapped in serenity. Inside, time seemed slower. People stretched, shifted, reclined a little more. A man laughed softly at something his wife whispered, covering her hand with his. A teenager listened to music so loudly the bass line could be heard leaking from his headphones. And still, the hum of engines remained the constant, the invisible assurance that everything was exactly as it should be. The pilot's voice had not broken through the intercom in some time, which only reinforced the feeling of safety. Passengers often felt reassured by silence, by the absence of updates, because it meant nothing required attention. The crew at the front, unseen behind the locked door, was managing the journey with quiet confidence. In a way, every flight was an act of trust. Hundreds of souls placing their fate into the hands of people they might never see. But on this flight, that trust was so unshaken, so complete, that nobody even considered it. The calm was infectious. Even those who normally feared flying began to drift into uneasy sleep, soothed by the routine of it all. The turbulence was minimal, the air smooth. Seatbelt signs remained dark. A woman in the aisle seat flipped idly through the pages of her book but didn't absorb the words, because her body was already surrendering to the lull of altitude. The engines carried on, hypnotic, endless, steady. In that moment, everything was ordinary. The calm had stretched so far and so wide across the cabin that it almost seemed unbreakable. Passengers trusted the quiet, trusted the machine, trusted the rhythm of the flight. Nothing pointed to danger. Nothing warned of change. Nothing whispered that the atmosphere could shift in a heartbeat. The flight, at least for now, was calm. Passengers exhaled their trust into the recycled air, unaware that serenity could be so fragile, that peace could be so temporary, and that the hum of those engines, the very sound they relied on, could falter without warning. It began so suddenly that at first, no one understood what was happening. The engines, which had been a constant presence, shifted in tone. What had been a steady hum dropped into a grinding vibration that rattled the cabin walls. The floor beneath the passengers trembled, a shiver running from the nose to the tail, and heads lifted instinctively, as if every person aboard had felt the same invisible jolt. The stillness of the night was shattered, replaced by the raw, mechanical sound of something straining against its own limits. The first alarm pierced the cabin with a sharp, electronic scream. It cut through the half-sleep and idle chatter like a blade. Lights flickered across the panels above the crew's stations, and the overhead signs blinked to life, glowing red where only calm darkness had been before. The suddenness of it seized the air. The attendants, who only moments before had been moving gracefully through the aisles, froze mid-step. Their smiles faltered, their practiced calmness slipping into expressions of shock they hadn't prepared to show. Then came the lurch. The aircraft dipped, not steeply at first, but enough that stomachs dropped and drinks spilled from half-empty cups. A thin scream came from somewhere near the back, followed by gasps and the sound of tray tables rattling against locked positions. The cabin tilted again, stronger this time, the movement unnatural and violent. Luggage shifted in the overhead compartments with dull thuds. Passengers clutched at the armrests, their quiet trust evaporating as the realization spread through the rows. Something was very, very wrong. The engines roared again, but now the sound was uneven, a desperate coughing that echoed through the wings. It was a sound that carried no comfort, only dread. For those who had flown often, the difference was unmistakable. For those who had never experienced flight trouble, the sound still tore at their instincts, warning them in ways words could not. Every human body on board registered it. The power that had carried them through the sky was faltering. Another alarm blared, louder than the first. A chime, then another, until the cabin felt drenched in warnings. Oxygen masks did not yet fall, but the sense that they could at any moment hovered in the minds of every passenger. The lights above flickered, dimmed, then returned, as though the aircraft itself were struggling to breathe. Attendants scrambled now, voices raised but words lost in the chaos of noise and panic. People began to shout questions no one could answer. What's happening? Are we going down? Is this normal? The words tangled into a desperate chorus, swallowed by the alarms and the grinding engines. A man stood halfway, only to be shoved back into his seat by the sudden drop of altitude that bent spines and sent stomachs upward. His cry of fear dissolved into silence as the aircraft groaned again, metal straining under invisible forces. Some passengers prayed out loud, gripping rosaries, muttering verses, whispering names of their children, of God, of anything that could hear them. Others stared wide-eyed at the seats ahead, paralyzed into stillness, breaths coming in shallow bursts. A child began to cry, his voice thin and sharp, and the sound carried like a knife across the cabin, reminding every adult of what was at stake. The attendants shouted now, their voices straining with authority but edged with their own fear. Remain seated. Seatbelts on. The words repeated, louder, urgent, yet they seemed powerless against the rising tide of panic. Every jolt, every dip, every vibration of the fuselage screamed louder than instructions ever could. The smell of burned metal began to thread faintly into the air, so subtle that only a few caught it at first. But soon, it spread like a ghost, twisting into the recycled cabin air and confirming the worst fear no one wanted to name. The machine that was supposed to carry them safely above the earth was in pain, and its suffering filled the senses. Panic sharpened now, breaking into chaos. Some passengers sobbed openly, clutching the hands of strangers. Others shouted into the air, demanding explanations that would not come. Every second seemed longer than the last, stretched by uncertainty, thickened by fear. The alarms wailed on, merciless, indifferent to the hearts that pounded beneath them. And then the turbulence hit. The aircraft shook violently, as though seized by invisible hands. Overhead compartments rattled, bags thudding and falling from their latches. A laptop flew free, striking the aisle with a metallic crack. Drinks spilled in arcs across the cabin, droplets catching in the flicker of lights. The floor felt unsteady, as though gravity itself were breaking its rules. The chaos reached its peak as the engines sputtered again, gasping for strength they no longer seemed to hold. The sound was unmistakable now, not a hum, but a choke. The alarms screamed louder, red lights flashing, warning signs glowing with urgency. Panic had become absolute. Every passenger knew they were no longer passengers on a routine flight. They were in the grip of something uncontrollable, a descent that no one could predict, a nightmare that no one could wake from. The cabin was alive with panic, but at the same time, something else began to settle in, a silence that came not from the absence of noise but from the absence of answers. The passengers were speaking, shouting, crying, but none of their words carried solutions. Each voice rose into the same void, a desperate question hurled into the air, only to dissolve against the chaos without reply. Fear spread in waves, consuming row after row, yet no one among them knew what to do. No one could tell the others that it would be all right, because nobody believed it themselves. Faces turned toward one another, searching for reassurance that never came. A man clutched the hand of his wife, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was terrified, powerless, and she saw it. A mother bent over her daughter, whispering promises she could not keep, pressing her child's head against her chest, as if the shield of her body could hold back what was rushing toward them. An elderly man crossed himself repeatedly, whispering prayers through clenched teeth, his lips trembling as he spoke. In every row, the same image repeated itself, bodies stiff with terror, minds racing for an explanation, for an anchor, for any sign that someone, anyone, knew what to do. The attendants, usually the embodiment of calm, had slipped into a frantic rhythm. Their steps were quick, their voices sharp, clipped with urgency, but their faces gave them away. They were trained to soothe, to reassure, to cover their own fear with polished confidence, yet the edges were breaking. Their eyes darted toward the cockpit door again and again, waiting for it to open, for the captain's voice to fill the intercom with instructions that would explain everything. But the door stayed closed, and the speakers remained silent. The absence was louder than any alarm. Every second of silence deepened the panic. People began demanding answers, their voices cracking with desperation. What's happening? Tell us what's going on. Are we going to crash? The questions piled on, but the attendants had nothing to give. Their responses were short, rehearsed, stripped of detail. Remain calm. Keep your seatbelts on. Stay seated. They repeated the phrases like mantras, but no one believed them. Passengers could see it in their eyes. They didn't know either. Fear shifted then, from chaos to paralysis. Some passengers went still, hands gripping the armrests so tightly their knuckles turned white, eyes fixed ahead but unfocused, trapped inside their own spiraling thoughts. Their minds filled in the silence with their worst imaginations, with the certainty of disaster. Others leaned toward the windows, searching the sky for something. Land below, stars above, another aircraft. Anything that might tell them where they were, what was happening, how much time they had. But the windows showed only darkness and cloud, nothing that could calm the storm inside their chests. The sound of the engines, sputtering and uneven, only deepened the terror. Every stutter was a reminder that the machine was failing them. Every jolt of turbulence confirmed that their control over their own lives had vanished. The alarms wailed on, merciless and mechanical, a chorus that refused to be silenced. Yet even as sound filled the cabin, it was the lack of human answers that cut the deepest. No voice of authority came to steady them, no explanation to transform fear into action. Children cried louder, their innocence amplifying the dread of the adults. Their cries were pure, unfiltered, the sound of beings too young to understand death, but old enough to feel fear in the marrow of their bones. Parents held them tighter, rocking them, shushing them, promising them safety. Those promises echoed through the cabin, but they were promises made to children and parents alike, fragile lies spoken against the truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. Some passengers tried to take control, standing, raising their voices, demanding that someone do something. But each attempt was swallowed by the violent shake of the aircraft, by the attendants who shouted back at them to sit, to buckle, to stay down. Authority clashed with desperation, but still, no real answers came. The air grew heavier with the weight of uncertainty, pressing down on lungs, tightening chests, forcing shallow, rapid breaths. Even those who tried to hold on to reason found it slipping. They calculated distances, replayed news stories of other crashes, told themselves the odds of survival, but none of it anchored them. Logic broke under the pressure of the unknown. They were suspended in the sky, held by a failing machine, with no information, no plan, and no one stepping forward to give them either. The collective fear crystallized into a single truth: they were alone. Each passenger felt it in their own way, but the realization bound them all. The people they trusted, the pilots, the attendants, the systems, the voices of authority, were silent. Panic was no longer a storm to be calmed. It had become the air they breathed, a suffocating fog that filled every row, every heart, every thought, while the silence from the cockpit grew heavier, louder, unbearable. Through the storm of alarms, cries, and rattling metal, a movement cut through the chaos, measured, deliberate, and unlike the frantic gestures of everyone else. While the passengers clung to their armrests, while attendants tried and failed to mask their panic, a single figure rose slowly from his seat. He did not stumble with the tilt of the aircraft. He did not flinch at the sound of the failing engines. His steps were controlled, his eyes steady, his breathing even, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. The presence of calm in the midst of panic was so unnatural, so jarring, that the people around him fell quiet without realizing it, their attention pulled toward him like iron to a magnet. He wore no uniform, at least not the kind that marked him as a soldier, but everything in the way he carried himself revealed it. The square set of his shoulders, the precision in his movements, the unshakable calm that clung to him like armor. He was no ordinary passenger. Even before his voice carried across the aisle, those who saw him knew instinctively. This was someone who had seen fear before, someone who had lived inside chaos and survived it. While others gasped and cried, he scanned the cabin with sharp, calculated eyes. He was not looking for comfort or answers. He was assessing. Every shake of the fuselage, every pitch of the nose, every stutter of the engines was measured against knowledge he carried deep within his bones. His hands steadied against a seat back, not out of fear of falling, but to hold himself firm as he judged how much the aircraft was losing control. His composure radiated outward, bending the fear of those nearby into something quieter, not gone, but momentarily held at bay. Passengers watched him with the hunger of drowning men seeing a lifeline. In the absence of the captain's voice, in the silence of the cockpit door, here was someone who looked as though he belonged in control. Whispers rose around him, questions, pleas, fragments of desperate hope, but he did not answer right away. He continued to study the scene, his jaw tight, his mind running faster than his body showed. He was not paralyzed like the rest of them. He was calculating. Then he spoke, and his voice was like a blade cutting through the storm. It carried no hesitation, no tremor, no trace of panic. It was firm, sharp, commanding, and it demanded attention without shouting. In an instant, the cabin seemed to still, passengers leaning forward unconsciously, drawn by the tone of authority. It was not the voice of a man uncertain of his words. It was the voice of someone who had led others through moments where survival itself balanced on seconds. Attendants turned toward him too, their training warring with their instincts. They were supposed to be the authority in the cabin, but they recognized something in him that outranked their scripts, something that came from experience they did not share. One of them opened her mouth to interrupt, to maintain her role, but stopped when she saw the look in his eyes. It was not defiance. It was leadership, clear and absolute. The passengers closest to him began to shift in their seats, following his instructions without question, their fear given a shape it had not had before. Where there had been only panic, there was now a sense of direction, a thin thread of order weaving itself through the chaos. His presence did not erase their terror, but it gave them something stronger to cling to than silence. His movements remained calm, unhurried, precise. He bent slightly to reassure a trembling child, his hand steady on the boy's shoulder. He looked into the eyes of the mother beside him, and she seemed to breathe for the first time since the alarms began. He adjusted the posture of a man gripping his armrest so tightly his fingers were turning pale, showing him how to brace properly. Small gestures, but each one carried the weight of experience, each one grounding the people around him in the belief that not all hope was lost. As the plane shuddered again, his body stayed balanced, legs braced as if he had spent a lifetime standing steady on shifting ground. His composure contrasted so sharply with the surrounding panic that it felt almost unreal, as though he were operating in another dimension, one where fear had no power. And that difference, that unshakable center, rippled outward until even those who could not hear his words felt some of the weight lift from their chests simply by watching him. He was a Navy SEAL Aviator, though few on the plane knew it yet. His training had carried him through battles, through chaos where hesitation meant death, through storms that bent even the strongest men. Fear was not foreign to him, but it did not own him. And in that moment, as the rest of the passengers buckled under terror, he alone stood unbroken, his calmness rising like a wall against the flood of panic that threatened to drown them all. The cabin had narrowed into a tunnel of noise, alarms, sobs, shouts, the violent cough of the engines, but in the middle of it, the SEAL Aviator moved with purpose. His eyes locked on a single row, as if he had seen something no one else had noticed. People followed his gaze, confusion sharpening their fear into questions that never made it past their lips. He took a step forward, then another, steady against the turbulence that made others cling helplessly to their seats. His expression was focused, every line of his face carved with certainty. Passengers leaned back as he passed, some reaching out, some whispering for help, but he did not slow. His attention was unwavering, his mind calculating, processing the angles of the plane, the shifting weight, the unseen forces pulling against the metal body in which they were trapped. To him, the cabin was no longer a place of chaos, but a map, and in that map there was one point that mattered above all others. He stopped suddenly, his hand gripping the edge of a seat. The passenger sitting there, a young woman who had been frozen in fear, clutching the armrests so tightly her fingers had gone pale, looked up at him in shock. Her wide eyes searched his, as though asking why he had chosen her, what he could possibly mean by stopping here, by focusing on her while the entire plane seemed to be falling apart. The SEAL did not waste words. He pointed directly at her seat, his arm steady, his finger unwavering. The gesture carried with it a weight that cut through the noise of the cabin. It was not random. It was not a mistake. It was deliberate, decisive, absolute. The passengers around them stared, their fear momentarily interrupted by confusion. Why her? Why that seat? The young woman blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to speak, but found no words. Around her, whispers spread quickly, a ripple of speculation racing through the rows. Some thought he was moving her to safety. Others thought the seat concealed something, a hidden flaw, a danger. The uncertainty pressed against the edges of their panic, reshaping it into raw curiosity and unease. His eyes met hers, and in them was something steady, something that demanded trust without explanation. He gave no lecture, no detailed instruction. He simply held her gaze, the unspoken message clear. This moment mattered, and she was part of it. He pointed again, firmer this time, ensuring that everyone watching understood the precision of his choice. It was not an accident. It was not guesswork. He had selected her seat for a reason. The attendants hesitated nearby, torn between maintaining control and yielding to the authority that radiated from him. Their training told them to remain the figures of guidance, but their instincts told them to listen. They glanced at one another, then back at him, their own panic caught between duty and the certainty that he knew something they did not. The passengers closest to her shifted uneasily, craning their necks to see what he had identified. A man across the aisle muttered questions under his breath. A woman leaned forward, trying to read the aviator's face for clues. The air seemed to tighten around that single row, the focus of hundreds of eyes narrowing on one point in the cabin, the young woman caught in the middle of it. She swallowed hard, her pulse racing, her body rigid. Her seat had become something different now, no longer just a place she occupied, but a symbol, a decision, a focus of attention. The aviator's finger remained fixed, his body unyielding. He had chosen her, chosen that spot, and everyone around them felt the weight of the decision pressed down on their own fear. The engines groaned again, shaking the cabin violently, but his stance did not falter. The lights flickered above, casting shadows across his face, but his expression did not change. He was absolute, rooted in his certainty. Passengers who had been on the edge of hysteria paused, if only for a breath, as they watched him. His calmness, his unshakable presence, and his precise gesture had stolen the momentum of their panic. The cabin, for all its chaos, had been reshaped by a single act. A man who had seen combat, who had lived in the teeth of danger, had pointed to her seat with the gravity of a commander issuing an order. And though no one yet understood why, though the air was still thick with fear and confusion, they knew instinctively that this moment was not random. It was a decision, sharp and deliberate, a signal that carried a weight none of them could yet comprehend. The air inside the cabin felt heavier than oxygen should allow, thick with fear, whispers, and the pounding of hearts that seemed louder than the failing engines. Passengers leaned forward, twisted in their seats, eyes darting between the aviator's steady stance and the woman whose seat had become the center of attention. They did not understand why he had chosen her, why his unwavering finger pointed there. But they could feel it. This was the turning point. In the middle of chaos, with alarms still wailing and the aircraft trembling, a choice had been made. And that choice carried a weight that pressed against every soul on board. The young woman trembled beneath the invisible spotlight. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her throat dry, her hands locked like claws around the seatbelt buckle. She wanted to ask him why, to demand an explanation, but his eyes silenced her. They were not eyes of chance. They were eyes of certainty, of experience honed by years in situations where hesitation meant death. He had pointed to her seat with the same precision he might have used when identifying a target in combat, and she knew in that instant there was no randomness to it. Around them, confusion rippled through the cabin. Some passengers whispered in disbelief, trying to piece together the meaning. Others stared openly, their fear clashing with the flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this man knew something they did not. The attendants hesitated still, caught between protocol and instinct, their own composure breaking under the weight of his unspoken authority. Even without words, the SEAL Aviator's presence filled the space like a command post, his decision standing taller than the alarms, stronger than the rattling of the fuselage. He gestured again, sharper this time, reinforcing the message that this moment mattered. The woman's pulse thundered in her ears. Her seatbelt strap felt like iron across her lap, anchoring her in place as if destiny itself had tightened it. She could not look away from him, could not deny the weight of his stare, even as tears welled in her eyes. In that silent exchange, she realized she was not being asked. She was being chosen. The passengers around her shifted nervously, some shrinking back as though danger clung to her row, others leaning forward with desperate curiosity. A man behind her muttered a prayer under his breath, the syllables barely audible but charged with fear. A child clutched his mother's hand, his wide eyes locked on the aviator's finger, sensing without words that something monumental was unfolding before them. The air quivered with the intensity of it, the collective understanding that whatever happened next would stem from this moment, from this choice. The aircraft jolted again, throwing drinks from trays, sending another round of gasps and cries through the cabin. Yet even as the plane seemed to rebel, even as gravity shifted beneath them, the aviator did not move. His stance was carved in steel, his fingers still pointing, his body unyielding. He was a pillar of control in a space drowning in panic, and the contrast was so sharp it made the passengers pause in their terror, if only for a breath. The woman's lips parted, her voice caught in her throat, but no sound emerged. She wanted to refuse, to shrink back, to deny the crushing responsibility that seemed to settle on her shoulders, but his eyes held her there. They spoke more than words ever could, that this was not about comfort, not about fairness, but about survival. She had been marked, not as a victim, but as a piece of the decision that would decide them all. The cabin grew quieter in its own strange way. The alarms still shrieked, the engines still coughed and groaned, but human voices dimmed, as though everyone recognized that they were witnessing something larger than their fear. The aviator had taken command not by rank or uniform, but by sheer presence, by the certainty of a man who had walked through fire and refused to flinch. His choice was the only light in the storm, and that light now rested on her seat. Passengers exchanged glances, silently asking each other the questions they were too afraid to voice. Why her? What made that seat different? What did he see that they could not? The silence that followed those questions was heavier than noise, pressing against their ribs, tightening their chests. But even in their confusion, even in their terror, there was a shift. They were no longer a cabin of strangers drowning separately in panic. Their attention, their fear, their fragile hope, all of it had narrowed onto one decision, one gesture, one seat. The aviator's hand finally dropped to his side, but the weight of his choice lingered in the air like a brand. The passengers stared at the young woman, at her trembling hands, at the seat that had been marked with silent authority. In their eyes was a mix of confusion, fear, and a fragile thread of belief that this moment, this decision, might be the hinge on which everything turned. And as the plane shuddered once more, the reality sank deeper into every heart on board, that whatever came next, it had already been set in motion by the finger of the man who stood calm in the storm.